You're watching Public Comment every Thursdays at 8 a.m. The live stream. Detroit is different and Bridge Detroit. Local politics of Detroit. All right, all right, all right. We are welcome back to Public Comment. And this week, we're talking reparations. We're talking reparations. I don't know if you all got the opportunity to check everything out, but Malachi Barrett of Bridge Detroit and Public Comment wrote an excellent three-part series breaking down so much about reparations at the top of this month. So I urge you, it's going to be a long read. And when I say a long read, maybe carve out about an hour and a half of your time, not just to read it, but to digest all the information, unpacking so much of this three-part series about reparations and the city of Detroit. I'm Khary Frazier here on Public Comment, and Detroit is different. Definitely joined by the man that I just spoke about writing this excellent three-part series. Malachi, how are you today, my brother?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I'm glad we're able to talk about this a little bit because it is a lot. The reporting was a lot. I know people. It takes time to really work through these bigger stories, but we're trying to break it down, trying to highlight kind of the most important parts for folks.
Yep, and we're gonna make it real simple for you. And when I say real simple for you, it was like, all right, how do we even break this down? Was like a question that me and Malachi had before we started recording today. But we're gonna make it very simple. What you need to know about reparations. What reparations do the people want? That's question number one. Let's start with the people. This is Public Comment. So the people play a big role here, and this is definitely very key. So let's go back to 2021. There was a ballot initiative that was definitely introduced through Keith Williams that sits on this Reparations Task Force. That ballot initiative was for Detroit reparations. That's what we knew. People were going to the ballot saying reparations, 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 reparations. So this was voted on, I want to say 80%. And you would imagine something like that in a black city, we're going to support reparations. So let's get into what the people want. And the article explores a whole lot of that. And even a member that was on the task force before, Anita Bell, I believe when people hear reparations, they're thinking cash payout. They want a check. You speak on this in what you write in the piece, and the cash payout. Other people, you spoke to a brother from American descendants of slavery, and he was speaking about that's what the functionality is, that's where things go. But reparations itself historically can mean a lot of things, but we're going to what the people want. People, I believe, want a check. Malachi, feedback on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most vocal crowd that's been coming to these meetings and making themselves heard are a group of residents who want cash payments, which is like really the traditional model of reparations that people have talked about for such a long time. What's interesting about this effort is, and we'll get into this more later, Detroit task force leaders say that they're trying to address harms that were caused specifically by the city against Black residents. And a lot of that, if you look back over the last century, has to do with housing discrimination, has to do with Black residents not being allowed to move into certain neighborhoods, being pushed into certain neighborhoods, being dislocated and kind of shuffled around by development projects. Black Bottom and Paradise Valley are kind of the key example there. And so there's a lot of questions about like what do we do about housing in particular. Other cities, and we'll talk about this later too, I'm sure, have done things with like down payment assistance grants. I think there is a desire for that. There's an ARPA program right now, federally funded, that's paying for some down payment assistance, but it's kind of a drop in the bucket. People are talking a lot about overassessment though, which is, something we've talked about a lot on this podcast. As kind of like a more modern recent example of the city continuing to cause harm against residents. It's something that needs to be made up for.
In reference to that in your article, Reparations Task Force member Edith Ford even says that directly, that Tax assessments is just a new iteration of the continued harms and uh, discriminatory practices that Black residents of Detroit have to deal with from a state. Well, now I'm adding from the federal government, the state government, and even the local municipality. This was where Edith Ford kind of went into that. And cutting the check, it's a whole movement around this between ADOS and Foundational Black Americans. It's like cut the check. That's what people say.
Yeah.
In Cobra, cut the check meaning a cash payment directly. So reparations to a lot of Black American means that, and even I think to non-Black Americans that feel like we didn't have nothing to do with that. Why you need some money? But the idea is that it's direct payments for to Black people for the harms that they've experienced, not to Black people in reference to college tuition, not two Black people in reference to getting a home, not two Black people in reference to training so you can get a job, not two Black people in reference to like what else? Having access to a medical facility, like the money itself. I believe that a lot of people and what the people want is cash. And then with cash, they can make their own decisions about how they would like to repair themselves and their families for the harms caused them.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that like we're talking about problems that were caused by government, and I think that people want a disassociation with government when it comes to solving the problem, if that makes sense. So give me the money, I will decide what to do with it and how
Yes.
to best make up for the harm that was caused to me, as opposed to trusting another government process to work its way through and address the problem. I think that's kind of, some of the fundamental way people are thinking about it. But there's a lot that goes into this. I mean, certainly cash payments are kind of like seen as a starting point, not the end all be all necessarily, but something that kind of needs to be as part of the suite of options that are presented to people. Even leaders of the task force have said like it's not going to just be cash payments, but that should probably be part of what comes out of this.
And it's unique that when you speak of that, because former task force member Anita Bell uh, stepped down from the task force connecting to this because she felt as though the Evanston model, which we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, that a lot of the conceptually is spoken of municipal reparations and moving and veering away from direct payments is tough. So now let's get into like some of the science even for the direct payments. And as you all see, I pulled up that is Article 1. So if you find yourself on Bridge Detroit, you're going to look for that article. And you're going to see the other ones too in today's public comment, but make sure you tap into that. So the other challenge with this is the municipal structure of our government. And it's consistently spoken of as we talk about the tax assessments that legal counsel for our city, Conrad Mallett, always says that you cannot give direct payments to residents, even if the city harmed those residents directly. Uh, that's just not. That's something that needs to be changed in the state house. So this is the way that like this is kind of like a little bit of 101 municipal uh civics class that Kari's giving you right now, meaning that for the city of Detroit to give a cash payment to a direct resident or residents or group of residents, what needs to happen at that point in time is it'll have to go to the state house to be approved to the state, because the charter through the city of Detroit and how its purse strings and how it spends needs to go through the state house for something like that, establishing a new payment structure. So now it becomes lobbying and activating what happens in the Michigan State House for Detroit to provide reparations for people that experience municipal harms in the city of Detroit. So if you get this whole concept, and this is what leads to, you even spoke to this in the article. One of the people said, man, you just become apathetic to a lot of this process because you didn't have to go to the state house to steal my to harm me. You didn't have to go to the state house to do something nefarious to me and my family. But you do got to go to the state house to actually repair what was done wrong to us. It makes a lot of people give up all together on politics and feel like it's all a joke. Hence going back to cut the check and let me solve the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more we could probably say about how this process could be a way to help people who are frustrated with government re-engage with at least the city government, and maybe restore some faith and kind of build up, if this is successful and is really inclusive and brings people in, or could serve to kind of reaffirm those feelings people have about government not working, about these kinds of promises being made, and then it's kind of handed off to a group of folks who don't get the job done. Basically, that's going to be something what I'm really going to be paying attention to, is how does this kind of affect the broader like disillusionment with municipal government in Detroit. But I think it's important to talk about some of the ways that they're going to have to navigate this. And you're right. I mean, this is a persistent problem we keep running into, where the state law basically doesn't allow for the city to give money to residents for certain programs, even kind of like targeted things like this, like the overassessment, which we've talked about, a lot on this show. But we're in a kind of a different place compared to some other states. Evanston, Illinois, is a suburb of Chicago, mostly white suburb of Chicago too. Was really the first city to pass municipal reparations, and they created a down payment program. Later, they actually allowed for direct cash payments to Black residents, and they kind of framed it as people who lived in the city. I think it was like between like 1920 and like 1970 or something like that.
Yeah.
Basically, the people that were there during the the kind of codified housing segregation that was going on at the time, which matches up pretty neatly with Detroit's timeline on that as well. But Evanston was able to pay for this because they took marijuana taxes and they put that into a fund. Mm-hmm. Detroit's not as able to do that. We have a portion of our sales tax on marijuana comes back to the city. It is distributed to like local communities around the state.
But let me just say it to you, because this is something else that the city government's going to have to recharter with the state to even get taxes off of marijuana or liquor or something else that this does connect to.
And it's not enough money too, is what I should say. Is like we just get $2 million off of that a year. Yeah. We don't have a separate tax on marijuana. We just are able to kind of get a portion of what the state.
Yeah.
And Detroit isn't able to raise its own taxes, which is a problem. We've talked about on here before too.
And it's a couple of different things, because I sit on the finance committee of the Reparations Task Force, and it's a couple of different things that I've even said, okay, let's think of this. The first meeting, I bring up a couple of different things that I thought could work back when I was misunderstanding some of the things. As we get into the next question, what is the role of the Reparations Task Force? So this is a great question to start with, okay? So being that I sit on a subcommittee on finance of finding how and the ways to fund what's going to happen with reparations and how it could be funded, immediately my thought process is like a lot of the money that is tax captured, like in the Downtown Development Authority, and it deviated to other projects that are going towards development at a time. A great Detroit is Different, I urge a lot of you all to watch, is the one I most recently did this year with Theo Pride, where we really break down like, okay, how did these public-private partnerships begin, which perfectly framed. A lot of this began because as Black leadership started taking over a lot of cities, federal and state government money stopped coming into cities. So cities needed to become a lot more creative about how to get the revenue to fund the city. So this becomes the private-public partnerships begin spawning out, specifically in cities like Detroit and Gary, Indiana, Atlanta, DC, places with majority Black people, but more so places with Black leadership went into these partnerships. Detroit has had these partnerships for so long, and it takes and captures a lot of the tax money throughout the city of Detroit. Like downtown money is captured within downtown, so that money does not go into neighborhoods throughout the city. There are ways that in other partnerships that money goes to other places, but my thought process is a lot of that money now can be split, and that can be going right to the reparations fund, because clearly if these funds are funding billions of dollars for developments for billionaires to do business in Detroit. These same funds could be funding with billions of dollars to pay back and repair people that were harmed from the municipal government of the city of Detroit for acts and policies where the city of Detroit harmed its residents for things that it did. Feedback?
Yeah. So, I mean, the role of the task force is basically to study this question of what kinds of housing and economic development policies could the city create to address its history of discrimination against Black residents. That's kind of a mouthful, but they
wait. I hate to step in. This is another one of those tough things. The way that the ballot initiative was written and the way that the task force is chartered also caused some of the confusion within the expectations, I think, of where the public stands, because both speak to Jim Crow laws, enslavement of Black people, and Black people directly itself. Whereas municipal harms, to explicitly put a municipal harm outside of some of the deed restrictions, which that deed restriction still sits on this property and others, where no colored person can own property in certain places. It's tougher, especially the further you get from the 50s on up, to say explicitly this was for Black people, like the overassessed taxes. That's not it's just tougher to nail down.
Yeah. So this is a big kind of point of contention within the work so far, that there's residents who are, I mean, rightly pretty confused about what the task force is supposed to be doing, because there's this kind of conflict in how it's talked about by leaders of the task force and the city, and documents that were created kind of establishing what it should be doing on paper, right? And it comes down to like this municipal reparations versus the conception of reparations that people have had for most of their lives, which is it's supposed to address the history of slavery in the country, whereas municipal reparations are more focused on what has the city of Detroit done specifically, and that's the model that Evanston, Illinois has taken, and a lot of other cities are looking at, like, what did we do as like local entities to contribute to this problem, and we will leave what the state and the feds did to them. Maybe there will be you start at the local level and that inspires action along the line, but in Detroit, Keith Williams, the chair of the task force, and other leaders of the task force have said, we are specifically focused on what the city has done. I mean, the public meetings have revealed that a lot of residents aren't even aware of that distinction. When they went to vote on this, they had thought that this was about slavery. The resolution that the city council adopted, which established this task force, mentioned slavery in like its opening paragraph. Keith Williams has talked about how the ballot language needed to be broad enough that it would pass with enough support. And so, that suggests that maybe it was kind of intentionally framed as vague so that people would kind of bring their own idea of what reparations was to it when they went to vote on it. Members of the task force, like the co-chair Sidney Calloway, said, like, even when you think of reparations on a federal level, you go to slavery and cash payments. At the local level, they're trying to think about how these systems have impacted them, but that's still like the major thing that people.
And let me say this, like, also in understanding municipal harms, one of the number one things everybody brings up is Black Bottom. And what happened to Black Bottom as and it's so unique now because, like, I've even brought this up. So right now, Black Bottom Detroit was a district inside Detroit that is talked about as one of the historic places where so many Black people lived and Black businesses were thriving there. And eminent domain and put a freeway through it, I-375. Right now, that freeway is being transitioned over back to a greenway space. And it's interesting because while this green out is being developed, there are partners coming together and institutions that will commemorate Black Bottom inside the new I-375 project. So it's like they're going to look at statues of them being harmed. Like, in my mind, it's like mentally, I'm going to look at a statue of my people being harmed, and they're going to commemorate it when they could have just gave me some more land connected to this new project in my mind. But that's Khary Frazier thinking, okay? So that's a weird disposition itself. You know what I'm saying? It's like, why can't I just get part of the land that they had? But this also becomes one of those problems with Black Bottom when you talk about racism and the history of racism in this nation. A lot of the property in Black Bottom was not owned by Black people. A lot of the property in Black Bottom was owned by a lot of the Jewish people that were the few people that would actually rent to Black people. So if you're going to deal with the housing discrimination, the role of a person that rented a property where eminent domain happened, where the renter will take a precedent role over the person that owned it, I don't know where like we're getting into legal justifications and things that how it looks, you know what I'm saying? Where things look, and how they connect. Rest in peace, Mr. Goodman. I'm pretty sure like Bill Goodman could come on here, or Attorney Perkins could talk about this. But Todd Russell Perkins, shout out Attorney Perkins, and so many others. But it still gets back into like a lot of our laws, especially when we look at the justice system, are based on ownership and who owns. A lot of Black people did not even have the opportunity to own because of racist policies that existed more so in the state, county, and federal level, not as much in the municipal level. So now you see more and more of that relationship going back to like the municipal harm, and how do you heighten that and tie this to that? It becomes more of a like, all right, 1 second. How do I understand this, and how is this layered? And housing discrimination because of where things were, because we know what did exist, and we're not even to the point of who gets it. We're just to the point of identifying what those harms are, where now you all are understanding the variances of some of the things that you're facing from the municipal government, and also the understanding of the people, because at the root of it, the people still just want reparations for all of the harms that we've experienced, especially as Black Americans, but even Black Michiganders and Black Detroiters. This is specifically going to those harms as a Black Detroiter, and tying that directly to something as a Black Detroiter becomes a little bit more difficult when we're talking about municipal reparations, because now you're more so just talking broadly of my history as a Detroiter, unless we can explicitly see the resolutions and ordinances that signal out Black people no access.
Yeah, I think this is the tricky. I mean, it's a big responsibility that the task force has to study the harms, and they brought the University of Michigan on board to help them do that. Yeah. There's a report that's supposed to be created in just a couple of months here that should like identify piece by piece. Here are the things that we're going to try to address that were done to the Black community. But it's huge. It goes from just kind of the obvious stuff that we've been talking about with housing segregation and deed restrictions and redlining and all of that, to much broader questions about who's responsible for like environmental pollution that's affected Black neighborhoods predominantly, right? It's about like the education system, the state takeover of city resources through emergency management. The late Joanne Watson talked about part of a reparations agenda would include giving Belle Isle back to the city, would involve dissolving the Great Lakes Water Authority, would I'm sure there's folks who would like to see the dissolution of like the land bank and the downtown development authority as kind of part of this. So when it comes to like what was the harm, I mean, like we have a whole history to draw upon. It becomes a very kind of big big tent there once you start to look at these things, and then trying to gauge, like with what you're saying, the destruction of Black Bottom. Most of the residents that were there were not homeowners. So how do you kind of gauge, that the neighborhood was destroyed as part of an urban renewal project pushed by racist mayors, basically? I don't think that's controversial to say, hopefully. Cobo in particular. And so they were pushed out of that neighborhood, but how do you kind of calculate the wealth that was lost there? A lot of this is trying to deal with wealth gaps, which are very, very, obviously felt in Detroit when you compare the white and the black population along like home ownership
Yeah.
and wealth and all that stuff. So,
And then you also would have to, like, I mean, and Lord knows, I'm just like, you know what I'm saying? I'm just looking at it from a lens of logic and driving down that street. And if you drive down that street in that lens of logic, you also have to look at it from the lens of like, okay, if the if your renter was displaced, obviously the person that had to sell from the eminent domain of I-375 being built, they were mistreated as well, you know.
So they have a big role to answer that question. They've got a lot of things they're looking at.
So, all right, the history of reparations. I urge you all to watch my piece, and I assume if you're watching this, you probably definitely watched the piece "A Debt Owed." It was a video essay that I did in collaborations with the Reparations Task Force that just kind of really studies the arc of the history of reparations in the city of Detroit from the lens of John Conyers, Congressman Conyers, Honorable John Conyers, Reverend Dr. Joanne Watson, city council member, honorable, and also honorable reparations Ray Jenkins. So that gives a lot of the history, and you echoed this, but you also brought in one of the things I didn't bring in because he wasn't a Detroiter, and not necessarily though it happened in Detroit, but James Farmer's Black Manifesto, where it was the idea of reparations. It was a speech given here. It was a lot of speeches in the 60s. Even now, Black people are coming to Detroit and giving some speeches. So, so this Black Manifesto speech spoke to white churches and also Jewish synagogues and their debt for what role they played in the enslavement and the capturing and colonizing of Black folks, and they're the institutions that should be looked at for reparations, not necessarily the federal government. But you did speak to that, you know, and it's other histories and reparations. The Republic of New Africa, I uplift in the A Debt Owed piece, Chokwe Lumumba and Mario Bedelli played key roles as people working with John Conyers as things were being drafted. Janice Hazel, you spoke of, also a task force member, and at the time she was working with Congressman Conyers as well in his office, and it was many others that I would say like play a role. Cindy Owens, Detroit in the history of reparations go like very, very much back. It's a rich history, especially when we think of reparations Ray Jenkins, uh, and what that looks for, what that looks like. But also, this history of reparations in Detroit is really coming from the lens of what can be done on a federal level for direct cash payout, most definitely. And the roots of that is strong in Detroit. So this is also kind of adds to like, and I guess this may be the fourth time we say, even in this episode, it becomes kind of confusing when we look at from this municipal lens of a municipal harm, when most people, when they're thinking from the reparations movement and work in Detroit, still comes from the lens of enslavement and those harms connected from enslavement to Black people. Anything you want to add to the history?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really key point, that Ray Jenkins and John Conyers and Joanne Watson were really focused on federal reparations initiatives. I mean, they really wanted to create a federal commission similar to how we have a local task force that would study this question. But it was all based around slavery. Ray Jenkins, made it his life's mission to get this debt repaid, that Black slaves built the country for free, basically. And that was kind of the straightforward argument is, we deserve compensation basically for that, let alone all of the suffering that was established through law, and these kind of like legal racist structures. But what I wanted to do really with this third piece about the history was kind of show that there's a direct connection. There's a lineage between folks that were fighting for this 50, 60 years ago and what's going on today, that there's a direct line between people pushing for this at their federal level. So while Jenkins was convincing Conyers to introduce legislation calling for a federal commission, Watson was back here kind of making the case in City Hall and on the airwaves. All of this stuff kind of built together at a point, at the national and the state, at the local level, where, we could pass this ballot initiative. Other cities can take this work forward. And, I think it's just important to acknowledge that, like, people have been asking for reparations basically as long as America has been around. It's taken a lot of different forms throughout the years. The Black Manifesto was kind of one vision of getting white churches that had participated in the slave trade to pay up. Jenkins was really focused on education scholarships and direct payments, right, from the federal government. Now we're looking at what cities have done.
And let me go into this too. When you talk about, and I talk, it's in the video, I say, like, one of the strategies uplifted, because on the books of Detroit and also on the books of ordinance in Chicago, are ordinances on, if you do business with the city of Detroit and your business has ties to enslavement, you have to be explicit about that. And the reason that this exists, because there was also a legal argument to say, okay, let's just go after the companies that made money from it. So a lot of the banks that exist today and a lot of the insurance companies that exist today, let's put it like this: if they've been in business for 160 years, they was making some money off of slavery. So the thought process is basically, if you can tie that together, you can pursue them. This was an initiative led by a series of lawyers. Rest in peace, Johnny Cochran was one of them. But one of the things that they ran into was the corporations weren't disclosing any of the information. So as a strategy to get this going, Dorothy Tillman in Chicago, and then soon after, Joanne Watson, said, all right, if you want to get down here and do business with the city, you got to open up about your history. And with that information, a lot of those banks that came forward, I want to say like Bank of America. I mean, really, just go back enough in time. Bank of America, many insurance companies stepped forward and admitted this, and a lot of universities. So it's like, we can go after these institutions, because that was another pocket and pool of money to pursue, which leads us to the last question. What's the history of municipal reparations, which is relatively recent, like Google searchable recent, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, like last 5 years, let alone like last 10 years, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
been, there's really been like this explosion at the local level. And some states like California and New York have been studying this as well. But big cities like Boston, St. Louis, I could name some more if I get my list here in front of me. But
And before you even go there, I mean, one of the tough things also about this, like a lot of things politically, is people are feeling as though this movement is being appropriated and used from a political scope, and not from the grassroots victory that a lot of people that have been committed to this effort have been. So,
well, I think it's like it's a reaction to the stalling of progress at the federal level on one side, because as we just talked about, Conyers' bill to create a federal reparations commission basically has stalled in Congress for like the last, since he introduced it in like 1989, I think was the first year.
yep.
So there's a couple things going on. One is kind of the frustration that the White House is not interested in this, that Joe Biden has spoken somewhat favorably about the concept of reparations, or at least studying it, but has not really committed to doing anything about it. And there's a group of folks actually that have been pushing for him to create a reparations commission through executive order. This is all kind of tied into the electoral politics of 2024, where people are making the argument that if you want Black voters to feel like they are included in your government and are being listened to, this is something that you could do to help increase turnout. But, I'll leave it there. Basically, nothing has really happened at the federal level. So people have kind of turned toward the cities. There was also kind of this big moment of like awareness around reparations and kind of the case for it. That came, I think it was like in 2012 or so, when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote this article for The Atlantic that I think it was literally called like The Case for Reparations. You guys should look it up. That really kind of outlines this case of like how housing discrimination in Chicago was the example he used, held back generations from being able to generate wealth through property. And it's kind of like a foundational sin of like the last century, in addition to Jim Crow laws and all of that stuff. But this is a history that's really specifically felt in the Midwest. And then, the George Floyd reaction and response, I think, pushed a lot of people in the like business community and philanthropic world and even like on the political level to kind of grapple with questions of what are we doing about equity in a way that hadn't really been there before.
I definitely think that was a moment that had a lot of people in that space, big time. And with that, even since then, it's, from a lot of the organizers that I know and I connect with, even when it comes to the municipal task force and what their expectations are, is like, okay, are they appropriating our language? Are they taking things that we take, sacred and hold close to heart and not taking this serious? Are they just looking at it like something like a feather in the cap, something politically? This is something that's becoming more and more spoken of across the nation. This being such a predominantly Black city, the pressure is even more so on for that task force to deliver. And even, I don't know if so many people know this, and let's make this explicit. Even the task force role is to, upon completion, submit a series of recommendations for the municipal harms that the city of Detroit has caused residents. Those recommendations, validated through these series of different research studies, U of M and other places and other researchers, under that validity would would still be in a space to compel our city council to then vote for something to run up the chain to become an executive action. So like this goes back to Municipal Civics 101. A task force is an entity. A task force is an entity inside the way that our city of Detroit government is chartered under the under city council. City council does not have any executive actions. An executive action is basically taking action directly, similar to our president, meaning like our Congress or our city council decides how much money is budgeted for something because our city council has funded the Reparations Task Force, but in reference to like the executive actions of following up from those recommendations would be something that will fall into the mayor's office. And we know if it involves direct payments, it'll have to move into the state house and be approved through the state first before that even takes place. So a lot of this also is a learning lesson of municipal politics and the functionality of municipal politics, as well as something that's happening with reparations. All of this plays a role when we think of what this looks like locally, because once this report moves forward, and I believe a time extension has been extended, but the report was due in November. This report with recommendations and support of the research is supposed to lead to a response from city council. What's so unique about this task force, unlike any other task force in the city council, is that it doesn't even have a sitting city council member on it. Though supported and meetings have been attended, the public meetings have been attended from council member Mary Waters. Council President Mary Sheffield was one to, I guess, uplift this the most, like and speak to it and empower the task force. But what it will look like from those recommendations and what happens from those recommendations, so people have realistic expectations of what this task force will do, that's what will happen. And that alone has a lot of people feeling as though this is not the reparations that they were looking for. Now, what I learned from delivering the video essay of A Debt Owed, Not a Handout, is even with John Conyers, the same thing would have been done, a study. And from those study recommendations happen, because this is really more so speaking politically. So I already know it's a lot of people that are like, slamming down their phone or computer because you're mad about why you got to go through this, why you need a study. We already know what was wrong. And that is true. But you still need to justify it. It needs to have clear delineation and almost be built for policy. And with this research to study the recommendations in a process like this task force, now you have a stronger cause than just being a citizen moving forward with these actions independently, or a group moving forward with these actions independently to lead to a municipal action that would possibly scale up to the state. Well, it's going to need to, that will scale up to the state and the federal government through a city council and a mayor's office, just with the will of the people. This is step one. So recommendations is nothing. Recommendation report is not cutting the check at all, but it's a step that is necessary if we're looking to look at the municipal body to cut the check. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, not much really else to say there. We're waiting for recommendations, and then city council is going to be in charge of implementing. And when they get to that stage, which probably will be sometime next year, it's going to be, there's going to be a lot to consider about how they actually move that forward. Right now, the city council is not super involved in what the task force is doing. I mean, I'm sure they are talking behind the scenes, but they don't have much of a public role in this. The task force was set up as kind of different from other city council task forces in that there aren't any council members actually serving on the task force. It's all put together by people that they've appointed. Council President Sheffield has talked about getting more involved. Her staff is definitely at these meetings and has been, in close contact with the leadership as it's been working forward. But, she's talked about how this needs state and probably some federal help, especially when it comes to getting funding for it. So there is a lot of unanswered questions with this. We could probably sit here for another 40 some minutes and talk about it. But yeah, I think what is key to keep in mind is that, this is a public process. People can get involved. There's monthly meetings that happen. And there's also during the week, you can get involved in some of the committee meetings, which is a lot more like nitty gritty on, particular issues when it comes to like creating funding or creating policies around different areas like, health and education and property and all of that stuff. There's all these different committees that people can join on. There's Zoom calls. They are accessible now, which is a big step forward. So I would just say, I mean, people that are feeling maybe frustrated or confused about this process, like we're in the middle of it. We're almost kind of at the start of it still, and people can really get involved. And I would encourage people to do that because, this work really needs input from the public. It needs a public participation. It's not going to probably work the way folks want if it's just this group of people, making decisions. It really needs more involvement from residents. So
I definitely think so. But I'm thank you so much for delivering your articles and then sharing on public comment about it, because this public comment, and I know, I go on my soliloquies that I hope people can follow, has been one that I think is essential. And the bigger question that people need to ask themselves is not just even with reparations, but just government, period. A lot of people that are becoming more apathetic and disillusioned with it. You have to ask yourself, what's your realistic expectation for the role government can play in your life? How much to meet that expectation should you play a role in public policy? And also, if things need to change, how can you be a part of that change that exists? It's one of those old adages, but it's real. So sometimes it's outside of systems, sometimes it's within systems. Something like reparations, I believe, is a within system problem. Because if outside entities like foundations or banks or, I don't know, let's just say a philanthropist were to involve themselves in it, it's still not repairing the harms that were explicitly delivered through discriminatory practices. I believe for this to really be effective, the parties involved must be involved in this. And it's a hard history because it's tough to admit the ugliness of the nation, the state, and even the city when it comes to the ways that it's treated people, specifically Black people, my people. But unless we are looking to really repair that harm directly from those that were involved in it and not offshoots of things or commemorate things or shiny designs and fancy things, then it's going to just be tough for so many people to be a part of what's happening. I personally want to play a role, and I do want to see people get uh, get what's due. And I also want to continue to use this platform as a way that I hopefully can inform you to know some more of the functionality. If you want to dismiss the functionality, that's up to you. I just want you to have the information. So, as always, stay tuned to Detroit is Different. And there's other stuff happening that we'll be back to some regular city council business. Y'all already know next week. But Malachi, tell them how do they find about the notebook.
bridgedetroit.com. bridgedetroit.com. It's free. It's in your inbox. Today we looked back at the history of the Renaissance Center after the news last week that General Motors would be moving its headquarters out of that iconic riverfront symbol of Detroit's revitalization into what probably is looking like a new symbol of Detroit's revitalization in Dan Gilbert's Hudson site, and some of the parallels I was drawing there from how people were talking about the Renaissance Center. You know, it lines up pretty neatly with some of the conversations we're having about downtown Detroit today, and just kind of helps me understand that, you know, this long running history of Detroit's comeback, right, is always evolving and always kind of based in some marketing pitches. And how does that end up being carried forward is a good question, because the Renaissance Center now is looking kind of obsolete. I mean, I'm not really sure how to feel about it at this point. The future of it is certainly uncertain. So
it's, as I was telling somebody, it looks like a beauty supply store and a check cashing place may find their way inside the Renaissance Center one of these days.
Yeah, that would not probably be ideal. That's not really, probably not what the architect had in mind. But yeah, bridgedetroit.com, all that stuff is free. We are working for you. So send me an email about your thoughts. And, you know, we always try to be responsive to that. And, you know, I base a lot of what I do off what I'm hearing from people. So definitely reach out to us that way.
Yep. All right. Peace.